Hello everyone, welcome back to our discussions on the law of trademarks. In the last session, we were looking at the definition of trademarks as defined in the Indian Trademarks Act. And we had identified three ideas which are embedded in the definition of trademarks. The idea of there being a mark, the idea of mark capable of being represented graphically, and the idea of mark which can then distinguish the goods or services of one person from those of another. In the last session, we had looked at the idea of mark in some detail, and in our discussions, we had observed that law defines the word mark in a fairly broad manner, thereby enabling you to figure out as to how best you want to project your goods or services in the market and thereby attract the attention of your consumers. We had also then noticed that although the legal scope of the meaning of the word mark is fairly broad, yet at a conceptual level, the very word mark provides limitations of how far can it be stretched. And although the boundaries may be slightly ambiguous, yet we had noted categorically that the definition of the word mark cannot stretch to include either the properties of the goods or the concepts embedded in the goods or services. So having now discussed the meaning of the word mark, let's look at the other feature of the definition which I had highlighted in red, which is that the mark must be capable of graphical representation. Just a second. Now, in the definition, this is feature number 2 of the definition which I had highlighted, but in the context of what we've already discussed, you can also see this as the external limitation on the meaning of the word mark. Therefore, it defines how trademarks, what kind of marks can be registered as trademarks, right? So what do we mean by graphical representation? The Indian trademark rules define graphical representation to mean representation of trademarks for goods or services in paper form, and it includes representation in a digitized form. The underlying message is that anything which is visually perceptible and therefore can be reproduced on a paper in a digitized form, those things can be registered as trademarks. Why does law put such a condition? Go back to those four introductory points which I had mentioned. One of such points was the certainty of the subject matter. So it is believed that if something can be reproduced on a piece of paper, that defines the metes and bounds of that subject matter for us in a neat manner, and therefore it provides certainty to the subject matter which is to be protected, right? Now the issue here is that although the law may prefer one way of defining the mark for you, yet in the marketplace, in reality, in real life, as a trader trying to attract your consumers or trying to woo your consumers, you would experiment with multiple ways of attracting the attention of your consumer. You are not going to remain confined to certain possibilities thrown at you by the law. You are going to experiment with all ways of, as I said, attracting the attention of your consumer. So it is possible for you to adopt an attractive word for your goods to be sold, okay? But why should you limit yourself only to words? It is also possible that you adopt an attractive color combination for the products you are selling and thereby attract the attention of your consumers. It is possible that you maybe sell your products using certain fragrances applied on the product and thereby creating a distinction for your goods in the market as against your competitors. It is also possible that you pick up certain musical tunes in advertising your product, so that every time that tune is played, your potential consumers get to know as to what advertisement is being shown on TV or radio, etc. So all these possibilities and maybe more possibilities exist which can legitimately be used by traders in the market to seek the attention of their consumers and to distinguish their goods from those of their competitors, right? So the question arises that this requirement of graphical representation, which is broadly inspired by the need to keep the subject matter neatly defined, how far does this requirement or how much of flexibility can be shown by this requirement, so that many other ways in which traders distinguish their goods from their services can be incorporated into the definition of the trademarks, right? So the question is, what about sounds? Mostly jingles used by companies like the Airtel tune, which is so catchy and so popular that even if you have closed your eyes and you're not watching TV, but if that jingle is played, you know it is the Airtel ad which is being played on the TV. Similarly, companies also use smells, fragrances, odor applied on their products when they offer those products to you. The other day I had gone to the market to buy footwear for my younger daughter. She's just 4 years old, and in that section you would see, if ever you've been to a kids section of footwear shop, that there is a brand called Bubblegum, and that brand, the footwear actually has a very strong bubblegum smell to it. So even if you're not looking at the trademark embossed upon the product, the very smell of bubblegum would tell you what brand you are buying, right? So therefore, use of smell is enabling the trader to distinguish his or her goods from those of the competitor. And similarly, colors can also be used by traders in the market to distinguish their goods from those of their competitors, right? Now, in the definition of the word mark, color combination is already mentioned, and in that sense you may say that, okay, this is already part of what is confirmed by the definition. But the orientation with which the word color or the expression color I've used here is not in terms of color combination, so to say, which can be distinctive about the products to be sold in the market. In this case, I'm using the example of color in the sense of one single color, just as it is adopted by a company to suggest that it is different from other competitors in the market, right? So let's say in the case of Cadbury, purple color, right? That its packaging comes in purple color. So can that result in distinction being created? And secondly, can that be called as adherence to the graphical representation one way or the other, right? So let's look at what responses courts have given to such situations. Let's start with the first example, which is about smell marks. Keep in mind, we are trying to see how far can the demand of graphical representation be liberalized to accommodate some of these possibilities. Now, in this case, furniture was being sold with cinnamon smell applied to it, and in order to meet the requirements of graphical representation, they very cleverly thought of just writing it in words and meeting the requirements of graphical representation. Because as I said to you, graphical representation means something which can be written on a piece of paper. So they said trademark comprises a smell, aroma, or a sense of cinnamon. So are they meeting the requirements of graphical representation? Well, in one literal sense, of course, because this is written on a piece of paper, but in the sense of the spirit of that requirement, in the opinion of the court, they were failing to meet that condition. So this is what the court says. Court says the wording smell, aroma, or a sense of cinnamon lacked precision as a result of the degree of subjectivity it allowed in the determination of the question whether a fragrance exemplified the smell, aroma, or a sense of cinnamon, right? That these words are very ambiguous, and therefore they really do not help us identify as to what kind of smell is cinnamon smell and what degree of strength of that smell is what maybe is attempted to be registered by the trademark owner, right? Court further says, and the extent to which differing perceptions of different individuals could equally be regarded as benchmarks for the interpretation of the wording in question. In that sense, the purpose of having graphical representation, which is to introduce certainty about the subject matter in the law, is being compromised, right? Because these expressions, although graphical in their orientation, yet are failing to provide certainty about the subject matter to the trademark. Court further said, it did not provide as much information as people would realistically need to know in order to determine how closely a given smell matched the one graphic representation was intended to identify. So such an attempt was rejected by the court, in terms of its capacity to meet graphical representation requirement. Now, in this case, the European Court of Justice framed two questions for us, and thereby giving us a very settled legal position on how should we understand the capacity of or the potential of graphical representation to be accommodative of certain non-conventional trademarks. Okay, and by the way, these kind of marks are also called as non-conventional trademarks. Okay, so question number one in this case was, can definitional condition be met by the signs which cannot be perceived visually per se, but can be reproduced indirectly using certain aids? Second, if yes, are the requirements of graphic representability satisfied when an odor is reproduced in the following manner? Right? So these two questions were framed by the court to then provide us a settled understanding of what law basically demands and what it accommodates. Question one basically means that is it possible that in the use of the mark it is not visible, but in terms of the submission of application for trademark, there is a method or possibility of submitting the mark or a sample of the mark. Is that permitted by the law, right? And secondly, if the answer is yes, then what kind of submission at the time of filing of the application would satisfy the graphical representation of the mark, right? Would that be satisfied if I were to submit the chemical formula of the substance from which the smell emerges, or if I were to describe it in words like it happened in the previous case, or if I were to maybe deposit a sample of a liquid or a chemical from where such a smell emerges, or by the combination of all these things. Court responded by saying, first of all, court clarified as to what is being attempted by graphical representation, and court said there are two kinds of interests which are addressed by the graphical representation requirement. On one side, trademark office is enabled to process the application meaningfully by comparing it to whatever has already been registered. Only when the subject matter is certain in terms of its boundaries can its real comparison with everything else be made. If the boundaries are uncertain, then comparisons can also not happen. So therefore, for the trademark authorities to also act appropriately, it is required that there is some kind of certainty of the application of the subject matter which is claimed to be a trademark. On the other side, there is also a message being given through the graphical representation to the competitors in the market. For them, the graphical representation defines what they have to avoid, right? It acts like the fence on a piece of land you may occupy. So your fence identifies for your neighbors as to where they cannot step, right? Or what they should avoid, maybe trespassing. So having taken note of these interests being addressed by the graphical representation, court responded by saying that a trademark may consist of a sign which was not in itself capable of being perceived visually, provided it could be represented graphically and particularly by means of images, lines or characters, and that the representation was clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable and objective, right? So court kept the possibility open that if a mark in its use is still not perceptible to the customers, yet in terms of its submission to the trademark office, if it is possible to be represented through any of these means, then graphical representation requirement can be met, provided that such submission should be clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable and objective, right? So a musical jingle, when it is played along with the products which are advertised, jingle is not visually perceptible to me as a consumer, but if that jingle can be submitted in the form of graphical notations which then meet this requirement of being clear, precise, self-contained, etc., then the answer was that law keeps the possibility open. Okay, but in the facts of this case, was that requirement met by the kind of submissions which were made? The court responded in negative. Court said, in respect of olfactory sign, which is your smell signs, the requirement of graphic representation was not satisfied by chemical formula, because chemical formula was not the formula of the smell. Chemical formula was the formula of the chemical, right? And therefore, in that sense, it wasn't meeting the requirement of being clear, precise, self-contained, intelligible and objective. Similarly, by the description in written words, we've already seen in the previous case as to how court believed that such descriptions are ambiguous and therefore they are not clear, reliable, intelligible, etc. And also by the deposit of a sample of chemical which may give the odor, because that sample, first of all, as I said, is not the smell per se, it is emitting smell. And secondly, that sample is also not durable, because with the passage of time, it may just get exhausted in terms of the smell it emits. So therefore, although theoretically speaking potential was kept open, or the possibility was kept open, yet practically speaking the threshold was so high that it seems a little difficult for smell marks to really meet the requirement of being capable of graphically represented. What about color marks? Again, the same criteria applies on such color marks also. And I'm just clarifying again, I'm speaking about one standard color being picked up as as a kind of trademark by a particular company, right? I'm not speaking about color combinations per se, which are explicitly mentioned in the definition of mark itself. Now in this case, this telecom company suggested that color orange, which it presented to the trademark office in the form of a rectangular orange box, okay? So it simply claimed color orange as its identifying feature. Now again, court responded by saying that yes, it is possible that colors which are not limited by space in any way, okay, or not spatially delimited, it is possible that such colors also rise up to meet the definition of what a trademark can be. Yet in this particular case, the description of that color as orange, okay, was too ambiguous, because there can be many shades of orange. This orange may wither away with the passage of time. It may get faded with the passage of time. So as a subject matter, therefore, it cannot be relied upon, for a longer period of time, as a subject matter, right? So court suggested that it is possible in some cases for colors to become identifying features for their source identifying features for their proprietors, but the submission of the application has to rely upon terminology which is stable, which is reliable, and which is permanent. And for that, it is recommended that you use the sample of the color as one submission, but you also use international code or coding system which exists for the colors, and identify the color according to that code system, so that that stability requirement is being met. And one example of such successful trademark is this particular red colored heel from this footwear designed by Kristen Louboutin. So Pantone 1816663TP is the color code number, and this red in the sole is something which has become a source identifying feature for the company, that every time you see this particular sandal with this particular red color sole, that people identify this as coming from that company, right? So it is possible for colors to be registered in that manner, okay? And then let's come to the last of of the things which I had mentioned in the earlier slide. So what about sounds? So again, in this case, the attempt was to register the sound in the form of opening bars of Beethoven's Für Elise, that famous tune, and the crow of a rooster, which is Kuklek-Klu, as we often say in general conversation. The court responded by saying that the conditions which have been identified in the previous case, which I have already discussed, those conditions apply to sound marks also. So if your graphical representation in the form of graphical notation submitted in your application are clear, precise, self-contained, easily accessible, intelligible, durable, and objective, then your sound marks can be registered, okay? But that doesn't happen if you are doing any of these things. So court says in the case of sound sign, those requirements are not satisfied when the sign is represented graphically by means of a description using the written language, such as an indication that the sign consists of notes going to make up musical work, or maybe in the form of words, let's say the roar of a lion. If you were to just submit roar of a lion, that submission would not meet the requirements of the law. Or the court says the indication that it is cry of an animal or by means of a simple onomatopoeia like kuklekku without more, okay, or by means of sequence of musical notes also, okay. Simple statement of musical notes may also not suffice, because you'll have to give some more details of how those notes are arranged, where is the note in high pitch and low pitch, where are there if there are any pauses in between, etc., etc. Those details would have to be supplied along with graphical notation of it, and then it is possible that the requirement of graphical representation is met as per the expectations of the law. Now let's move on to the third dimension of the definition of trademarks. And the third dimension is related to the function a trademark is expected to perform, which is that it is capable of distinguishing the goods or services of one person from those of another. So what do we mean by the capacity to distinguish the goods or services of one person from those of another? In simple words, it means that the mark must have distinctiveness to it. Now this idea of distinctiveness, as we go ahead with our discussions in the next session, when we pick up section 9 of the Trademarks Act for discussion, which prescribes absolute grounds for the refusal of registration of trademarks, we would see that distinctiveness is one strong criteria on the basis of which a mark may be refused registration. And in that sense, some bit of discussion on distinctiveness we would do even at that stage. But in order to ensure that I give you a complete overall understanding of the definition of the word trademark, it is important that I engage with this component of the definition at this stage also. So let's look at what do we mean by distinctiveness, which basically stands for capacity of distinguishing the goods or services of one person from those of another. Let's look at one observation which I am borrowing from a particular English judgment, which is British Sugar versus James Robertson. Now in this case, a word called treat was being used for chocolates, etc. And the question was whether the word treat is distinctive, or it has the capacity to distinguish chocolate, the goods, the chocolate in this case, from this company, from goods, the same goods sold by any other company. So let's look at what the court said in this case to define for us this particular capacity. Court said, what does devoid of any distinctive character mean? I think the phrase requires consideration of the mark on its own, assuming no use. Is it a sort of a word or other sign which cannot do the job without first educating the public that it is a trademark? A meaningless word or a word inappropriate for the goods concerned, like North Pole for the bananas, or like in our case, I had mentioned Apple applied on smartphones, etc. So whether that a meaningless word or a word inappropriate for the goods concerned can clearly do, but a common laudatory word such as treat is absent use and recognition as a trademark in itself, devoid of any inherent distinctive character. So the idea is that it is possible that if I go out to buy chocolates with the word treat on it, the trader tells me that this word treat is being used by the company as the trademark of the product being sold, or the brand name of the product being sold, and therefore next time when I go to buy the same product, I identify the word treat as a trademark, and therefore I identify the goods belonging to a particular company. But the idea of distinctiveness, particularly when we are speaking about inherent capacity to be distinctive, that idea is not dependent upon this kind of education to happen of the consumer. Therefore, for a mark to be distinctive and hence capable of distinguishing the goods or services of one person from those of another, without education, the mark must tell me what it stands for. So when I look at Apple embossed upon smartphones, law assumes that mark itself is speaking out to me that it is a trademark, and I don't have to be taught by anybody else, or I don't have to get educated maybe by a repeated purchase of the same product to finally understand that this is somebody's trademark, right? So when we speak about capability of distinguishing the goods or services, at least if the claim is that a particular mark is inherently capable of doing so, then it must show this capacity of speaking to me directly without any intermediary explaining its meaning to me, or without waiting for me to get into the habit of recognizing it as somebody's trademark. Quote further said, the evidence must show that consumers did not need to become accustomed to the mark through the use made of it, but that it immediately enabled them to distinguish the goods and services bearing the mark from the goods or services of competing undertakings. Right? So this is the point I have already explained. Now, with respect to word marks or logos, this particular distinction being created here between a mark which appears different in its orientation, particularly vis-a-vis its application on the goods, and therefore stands out and therefore speaks to me as a trademark, as against marks which may be slightly descriptive or which may be highlighting some quality of the product, whereby my immediate impression of the word may not be that it's a trademark. Somebody may have to explain it to me that it's a trademark. Now, this dichotomy is easy to understand and appreciate vis-a-vis word marks or logo marks, right? Just to sort of reassert what I'm saying so that I'm not lacking clarity here. If there is a word mark or a logo mark which stands out as distinctive, then in that case, we can safely assume that it's a mark which has the capacity of identifying the goods and services and separating them from those of competitors. Okay, but this capacity of standing out, or this capacity of being different, okay, or this capacity of being recognized as such, is not so easy to be met as we go beyond the word marks or the logo marks. As we start going into the zone of what are called as non-conventional marks, there is a suggestion of caution to be exercised when we try to figure out as to if a particular mark is distinctive enough or not. Now, this particular, as you can see on your slide, I am borrowing this clarification from Curley's Law of Trademarks, which is the most authoritative treatise on the law of trademarks. So that treatise cautions us that with respect to such marks, the non-conventional marks, okay, different and distinctive are not to be seen as one and the same thing. So the idea is that, let's say I look at, and these particular observations were basically highlighted with respect to either the shape of the products or the appearance of the products, right? So the idea is this, that it is one thing to say that this is different, and it is another thing to say, therefore I assume this is coming from a different company, right? For a mark to be a trademark, when I look at it, I should get the message that this is coming from a particular company, right? So therefore, just because I am looking at something which is looking different from everything else, does not mean that I would necessarily conclude that therefore this is coming from a particular company, right? And if that is not the message coming to me, then difference would not automatically rise to the level of being distinctive, right? And in that capacity, therefore, Curley's Law of Trademark says that distinctive is not necessarily same as different, and following arguments are legally not relevant. So if somebody says my mark is different, or somebody says my mark stands out as it attracts the attention of the customer, or if somebody says that my mark evokes recognition, each of these three grounds basically are assuming that just because you are you can or that mark can seek attention and therefore can be recognized maybe next time when the customer is in the market, that it necessarily means that the customer would associate that difference to be equal to distinctiveness in the trademark sense, which, as I have already explained, need not be the case. Just at the cost of repetition, if I see a mark which is different, or if I see the dimensions of a product, be its shape or its color combination or its packaging, etc., and if that looks different to me, is that difference telling me therefore that it is coming from a different company? If yes, then yes, distinctiveness exists. If no, if my reaction as a consumer stops at just appreciating it for its difference, then in that case, it has still not shown the capacity of being distinctive as a trademark, right? And therefore, Curley says these arguments presuppose illegitimately that education of public through use has already commenced to some unknown degree. If a mark does possess inherent distinctive character, it should convey the trade origin message immediately when first encountered, right? So you don't have to wait for somebody to convey to you that, amongst that bunch of steel color bottles, that red color bottle basically is a peculiar mark adopted by a particular company. If somebody has to tell you that, then it means that red color is not acting as a trademark, inherently speaking. Now that of course doesn't mean that you can never register that. Then of course in that case the definition itself would become self-contradictory, because the definition is allowing you to protect shapes, packaging, color combination, etc. The idea is, at least at the moment when we are trying to understand the definitional components of trademark, the idea being conveyed to you is that in the inherent capacity of these marks there may be a problem, but they may eventually acquire that distinctiveness, and it is possible that the very same red bottle, which maybe 6 months back when it was launched was not conveying the same meaning of being a trademark, that 6 months down the line people have started identifying that peculiar red color on that bottle with respect to a particular company. And if at that moment you were to seek registration for it, it is very much possible that that particular dimension of the product is seen as capable of distinguishing those products from those of the competitors, right? So I hope you appreciated the essence of what I'm trying to say, that at the inherent level, what is the meaning of capability of distinguishing the goods and services of one person from those of another. Now, before I conclude, I also want you to appreciate one nuance which is emerging from our discussions. Okay, and the nuance is this: that definition of trademarks has expanded. It now makes it possible for you to adopt various kinds of marks without restricting those marks to either words or logos. And therefore, as I said, it's a fairly liberal regime. Yet when it comes to monopolizing some of these marks which go beyond what are called as conventional marks, the journey is slightly difficult, right? The overall legal regime keeps it slightly difficult for you to acquire monopolies over those dimensions of the marks whereby you may end up acquiring competitive advantage, right? So the law acts very carefully, and therefore it ensures that just because the definition is liberal, one should not end up acquiring competitive advantage over others in the market. So for example, if colors have impact on consumer psyche. So if one person ends up monopolizing a particular color which has the capacity of impacting consumer psyche, then in that case, if trademark were to be allowed straight away on that color without the trademark owner converting that color which is different in the market to being distinctive about the origin of the products, then in that case basically you are telling every other competitor that this consumer influencing dimension would be denied to you, and that would again amount to be to being unfair to those competitors, right? Similar is the case with smells also. The other day I gave you the example of this bubblegum brand vis-a-vis kids footwear. Now if you go to that any footwear shop which sells kids footwear, you would see that it's a very, very attractive smell, and it is possible that then as consumers it impacts on our psyche, that it pushes us a little more to buy those products as against the products of the competitors. And therefore if this smell is to be allowed monopoly too easily, then it would have the end result of giving competitive advantage to one company as against others, right? and therefore that would be problematic, right? So on one side you have the definition, which is allowing very many possibilities to exist in terms of how you want to construct your trademark. On the other side you have other parameters in the law, other doctrinal features of the law, which require a little more from your side in terms of your effort to transform that dimension of the product into a source identifying feature of the product, or to transform it as a badge of origin, right? So reconnect it with our theoretical explanation as to why and how law should protect trademarks. So with that, I think I'll close this session. Hopefully my engagement with 3 ideas as embedded in the definition of trademarks has helped you understand the definition or the idea of trademarks better. In the next session when we meet, we would move on to look at the grounds for the refusal of registration of trademarks in India. Thank you for your attention.